Good morning, dear students. Now we are going to discuss about the British poetry, and that is the block number 4th. In block number 4th, first of all, we would like to take the initial part, and then actually we will go. So first of all, we would like to discuss the Victorian age that is there in your syllabus, and we would like to understand how the Victorian age started. So you see, in our last sessions of Romantic age and the Romantic poetry, we discussed how a particular period started with the publication of lyrical ballads. In 1798, my dear friends, lyrical ballads was published. Lyrical ballads was a collection of poems by William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge, and it was it started a kind of movement, a special momentum in English literature, and that helped to launch the Romantic movement in English literature. It was very well supported by the late poets, William Wordsworth, S.T. Coleridge, Robert Southey. It was supported by the younger Romantic poets, George Gordon, Lord Byron, P.B. Shelley, John Keats. And apart from that, it was supported by, Jane Austen, Walter Scott, William Hazlitt, etc. Romantic age, as it is considered, was a very fertile age, and it is known for its fertility, it is known for its world-class poetry, it is known for its natural poetry, nature poetry. It went on almost for 50 years till William Wordsworth died. William Wordsworth was made poet laureate when Robert Southey was no more in 1843. And after 1843, William Wordsworth was the poet laureate of England till his death. In 1850, William Wordsworth died, and there was a vacuum on the stage of English literature. There was a vacuum on the stage of English literature when William Wordsworth died, because there was apparently no poet who was visible to be appointed as the poet laureate. Queen Victoria was also in dilemma. So she invited Alfred Lord Tennyson, and Alfred Lord Tennyson was given the charge of poet laureateship, and he was made the poet laureate, and Alfred Lord Tennyson announced this period, this age, as the Victorian age. Victorian age that came after Romantic period was also a productive period as far as literature is concerned, as far as the noble writing is concerned. And the prominent poets of the age were like Alfred Lord Tennyson, Robert Browning, Matthew Arnold, etc. So now we would like to discuss about some of the important people and about the features of the Victorian age. What was the Victorian age like? We would like to discuss about all these important things, my dear friends. While in the preceding Romantic period, poetry had been the dominant genre, it was the novel that was most important in the Victorian period. Charles Dickens, who was born in 1812 and died in 1870, dominated the first part of Victoria's reign. His first novel, Pickwick Papers, was published in 1836, and his last, Our Mutual Friend, between 1864-5, William Thackeray's 1811 to 1863 most famous work, Vanity Fair, appeared in 1848. And the three Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Annie, also published significant works in the 1840s. A major later novel was George Eliot's Middlemarch, while the major novelist of the later part of Queen Victoria's reign was Thomas Hardy, whose first novel, Under the Greenwood Tree, appeared in 1872, and his last, Jude the Obscure, in 1895. So as we were discussing, my dear friends, actually, that this was the time when, poetry was not that much prominent as it was in the Romantic period. In Romantic period, the poetry was very much prominent. But as a matter of fact, in Victorian era, in Victorian age, you see, novel writing became very famous, and many writers, many novelists wrote world famous novels. There were some poets also. Robert Browning was one of them, who was born in 1812 and died in 1889. And Alfred Tennyson, another very important poet who was born in 1809 and died in 1892, were Victorian England's most famous poets, though more recent taste has tended to prefer the poetry of Thomas Hardy, who, though he wrote poetry throughout his life, did not publish a collection until 1898, as well as that of Gerard Manley Hopkins, G.M. Hopkins, popularly known as, whose poetry was published posthumously in 1918. And then Algernon Charles Swinburne, A.C. Swinburne, famously known, is also considered an important literary figure of the period, especially his poems and critical writings. Early poems of William Butler Yeats were also published in Victoria's reign. So, as a matter of fact, there were a couple of poets also who were very famous, and they were writing poems. But the poem, the genre of the poetry was not written and developed in that shape as it was developed in the Romantic age, in the Romantic era. So that's what we were talking about, you see. And some popular names were there actually. Robert Browning was there, Alfred Lord Tennyson was there, G.M. Hopkins was there, A.C. Swinburne was there. So these were there actually, some of famous names were there. With regard to the theater, it was not until the last decades of the 19th century that any significant works were produced. This began with Gilbert and Sullivan's comic operas from the 1870s, various plays of G.B. Shaw in the 1890s, and Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest in 1895. So, almost same was the case with the dramas also. Same was the case with the dramas also. Not much development was seen, not much progress was seen in the field of dramas actually. Not much significant work was seen in the field of dramas. So, as a matter of fact, you see, actually, basically this age, this era, this period was devoted for the noble writing. Now let us come on Robert Browning, who was a prominent figure of the Victorian era, and he is basically known for his dramatic monologues. Dramatic monologues. Dramatic monologue was the special genre that was perfected by Robert Browning. Robert Browning, who was born on 7th May 1812 and died on 12th December 1889, was an English poet and playwright whose mastery of dramatic verse, especially dramatic monologues, made him one of the foremost Victorian poets. Browning is popularly known by his shorter poems, such as Porphyria's Lover, My Last Duchess, Rabbi Ben Ezra, How They Brought the Good News from Gain to Aix, and the Pied Piper of Hamelin, etc. So, as a matter of fact, Robert Browning, who is popularly known for his dramatic monologues, he actually made the genre popular. That was his work. And apart from that, he wrote some very famous dramatic monologues that are, you see, the special, the preservance of English literature today. His fame today rests mainly on his dramatic monologues, in which the words not only convey setting and action, but also reveal the speaker's character. Unlike a soliloquy, the meaning in a Browning dramatic monologue is not what the speaker directly reveals, but what he inadvertently gives away about himself in the process of rationalizing past actions or a special pleading, his case to a silent auditor in the poem. So, actually, he, as a matter of fact, it is a kind of a dramatic monologue has presented in his poems like a soliloquy, where he expresses, where he explains the character of that particular person on whom the poem is written. The Ring and the Book, very famous piece of literary writing by the pen of Robert Browning, is an epic length poem in which he justifies the base of God to humanity through 12 extended blank verse monologues spoken by the principals in a trial about a murder. So the Ring and the Book actually is basically a religious poem there. Actually, he talks about, you see, and justifies the God, the base of the God for humanity. These monologues greatly influenced many later poets, including T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. The work was a bestseller in its day, but a later critic, Anthony Burgess, commented, "We all want to like Browning, but we find it very hard." So, The Ring and the Book actually basically a kind of, you see, a religious work, and that is a very famous work by the pen of Robert Browning. If I say that Browning is known for because of The Ring and the Book, it would not be a wrong statement. And you see, Men and Women is a poetry collection by Robert Browning. It's a collection of 51 poems in 2 volumes by Robert Browning, first published in 1855, while now generally considered to contain some of the best of Browning's poetry. At the time, it was not received well and sold poorly. The Men and Women is a collection of poems actually written by Robert Browning, and initially it was not very famous, but later on it became very famous. Men and Women was Browning's first published work after 5 years hiatus, and his first collection of shorter poems since his marriage to Elizabeth Barrett in 1846. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who was also a poet, got married with Robert Browning. His reputation had still not recovered from the disastrous failure of Sordello 15 years previously, and Browning was at the time comprehensively overshadowed by his wife in terms of both critical reception and commercial success. Away from the spotlight, Browning was able to work on a long-considered project. He had long been associated with the dramatic monologue, having written 2 early volumes of poems entitled Dramatic Lyrics and Dramatic Romances and Lyrics, but with Men and Women, he took the concept a step further. So, actually, the collection had got some of the stimulant ideas related to their life, and the collection was not very much famous initially, but later on it became very famous. You see, so this Men and Women, Browning's Men and Women consists of 51 poems, all of which are monologues spoken by different narrators. It's a very important point to be noted that there are 51 poems, and all of which are monologues spoken by different narrators. Some identified and some not. Some narrators are identified, that who are they, and some of them are not identified. The first 50 take in a very diverse range of historical, religious, or European situations, with the 51st one word more, featuring Browning himself as narrator and dedicated to his wife. The first 50 take in a very diverse range of historical, religious, or European situations, with the 51st one word more, featuring Browning himself as narrator and dedicated to his wife. The title of the collection came from a line in her sonnets from the Portuguese. Browning himself was very fond of the collection, referring to the poems as my 50 Men and Women, from the opening line in one word more, and today Men and Women has been described as one of Victorian England's most significant books. So, actually, it had got the collection of the different poems and the sonnets also. 13 years after the publication of Man and Women, Browning revisited the first edition and made a reclassification of it. He separated the simpler rhymed presentations of an emotional moment such as mesmerism and a woman's last word, or the picturesque rhymed verse telling a story of an experience such as Child Roland and the statue and the bust, from their more complex companions such as Cleon, Filippo, and Rudel. The resulting collection of only 12 poems is typically found today in many abridged editions of Men and Women, and in the somewhat more accurately titled volume, Transcendentalism, a poem in 12 volumes. So later on, actually, he tried to revisit his collections and tried to make certain corrections over there. Now, actually, in the Victorian period only, this was the PreRaphaelite Brotherhood. PreRaphaelite Brotherhood was a kind of movement, but it was not as emphatic. It was not as, like as it was like a Victorian period was. The PreRaphaelite Brotherhood, also known as the PreRaphaelites, was a group of English painters, poets, and critics founded in 1848 by William Holman Hunt, John Millais, and D.G. Rossetti. The three founders were joined by William Michael Rossetti, James Collinson, Frederick George Stephens, and Thomas Bullen to form the seven-member Brotherhood. So actually the PreRaphaelite Brotherhood, that is also known as PreRaphaelites only, it was a group of English painters, poets, and critics. They were basically, so most of them were painters actually. This is a very significant point. This is a very important point about them, that most of them were painters, and it was founded in 1848, and it was a group of some certain people actually. And later on, you see they started calling the group as Brotherhood. The group's intention was to reform art by rejecting what it considered the mechanistic approach first adopted by Mannerist artists who succeeded Raphael and Michelangelo. Its members believed the classical poses and elegant compositions of Raphael in particular had been a corrupting influence on the academic teaching of art. Hence the name PreRaphaelite. In particular, the group objected to the influence of Sir Joshua Reynolds, founder of the English Royal Academy of Arts, whom they called Sir Slosua to the PreRaphaelites, according to William Michael Rossetti. Slossy meant anything lax or scamped in the process of painting, and hence anything or person of a commonplace or conventional kind. So what we were talking, you see, that actually the group's intention was to reform art by rejecting the mechanical the approaches that were adopted by the contemporary poets and all. They had the zeal and the desire. They had the zeal and desire of a poet in their poetry. So that was why they had a different approach to poems and literature, and that they tried to express in their poems. The PreRaphaelite Brotherhood, through the PRB initials, the Brotherhood announced in coded form the arrival of a new movement in British art. The group continued to accept the concepts of history, painting, and mimesis, imitation of nature, as central to the purpose of art. So at the beginning, actually, the group was continuing and to take the concepts from history and from the painting and from nature, and they were trying to establish the superiority of the art initially. Later on, the PreRaphaelites defined themselves as a reform movement. Later on, they started calling themselves as a reform movement, created a distinct name for their form of art, and published a periodical, The Jump. The Jump was the magazine published by these people to promote their ideas. The group's debates were recorded in the PreRaphaelite journal. So it was the book actually, that is where their ideas were recorded and published. The PreRaphaelite Brotherhood was founded in John Malay's parents' house on Gower Street, London in 1848. It was actually founded in London in 1848, and at the first meeting the painters John Millais and D.G. Rossetti and William Holman Hunt were present. So this was the first meeting when these three people, Millais and Rossetti and Holman Hunt, were present there. Hunt and Millais were students at the Royal Academy of Arts and had met in another loose association. The Cyclographic Club, Sketching Society. At his own request, Rossetti became a pupil of Ford Madox Brown in 1848. At that date, Rossetti and Hunt shared lodgings in Cleveland Street, Fitzrovia, central London. Hunt had started painting the Eve of St. Agnes based on Keats' poem of the same name, but it was not completed until 1867. So actually the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, the Pre-Raphaelite movement that was primarily started by these three people by their meeting actually, and then they had, you see, a kind of feeling to establish the supremacy of the art and the painting-like feelings actually, the picturesque qualities were taken into their poems and that they tried to establish in their poems. So later on, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood started becoming famous by the efforts of D.G. Rossetti and Christiana Rosetti, of course. Christiana Rosetti also. We would like to discuss about Christiana Rosetti in the coming slides because she was also a prominent figure of Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and she devoted herself for the development of this movement that is known today as the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. And as an aspiring poet, Rossetti wished to develop the links between romantic poetry and art. As a poet, actually, Rossetti wanted to develop a kind of link between romantic poetry and art. There is no doubt about it that the Pre-Raphaelite poets, the Pre-Raphaelites, were very much influenced by the picturesque techniques, by the natural techniques of the romantic poets and their art actually. And by autumn, four more members, painters James Collinson and Frederick George Stephens, Rossetti's brother, poet and critic William Michael Rossetti, sculptor Thomas Bullner, had joined to form a 7-member strong brotherhood. Ford Madox Brown was invited to join, but the more senior artist remained independent, but supported the group throughout the PRB period of Pre-Raphaelitism and contributed to the jump. Other young painters and sculptors became close associates, including Charles Elston Collins, Thomas Tupper, and Alexander Munro. The PRB intended to keep the existence of the Brotherhood secret from members of the Royal Academy. So, actually, initially, these people started the group, and they were 3 in number. Later on, some painters joined them. And these painters actually, along with these people, the Pre-Raphaelite concept, the Pre-Raphaelite movement developed in much more way. And actually, they tried to keep up the soul of Pre-Raphaelite movement for the wider dissemination. D.G. Rossetti, one of the very prominent figures who was the backbone of this movement that is known as Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood today. It was D.G. Rossetti who gave the idea and who was there to support him always. So he was born in 1828 and died in 1882. He was an English poet, illustrator, painter, and translator. So that is the special feature. That was what we were talking about, that in the Pre-Raphaelite movement, you see, the most of the people were painters. This is the special feature of this movement, you see, that we have to notice and we have to write also. And he founded the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood in 1848 with William Holman Hunt and John Millais. He was the person who founded this movement. He was the person who established Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood with the help of William Hunt and John Malaise, and was later to be the main inspiration for a second generation of artists and writers influenced by the movement, most notably William Morris and Edward Warne Jones. So as we were talking that later on, you see, he was the main person who tried to influence people, who tried to motivate people to join the movement. He was the man behind all the planning of this movement. His work also influenced the European symbolists and was a major precursor of the aesthetic movement. His work, you see, has influenced the people all over, particularly the symbolist movement and the aesthetic movement. They were very much, you see, influenced by the idea, by the symbols used, by the picturesque qualities that was used in the, you see, this Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Rossetti's art was characterized by its sensuality and its medieval revivalism. His early poetry was influenced by John Keats. He was influenced by John Keats in the beginning, and his later poetry was characterized by the complex interlinking of thought and feeling, especially in his sonnet sequence, The House of Life. So actually his later poetry had got a kind of complex interlinking of thought and feeling, and there actually he tried to express his, you see, internalia and internal feelings and internal desires and complexes and anxieties of his mind. Especially in his sonnet sequence, The House of Life, he tried to express those particular internal feelings of his mind. Poetry and image are closely entwined in Rossetti's work. He frequently wrote sonnets to accompany his pictures, spanning from the girlhood of Mary Virgin and Astrate Syrica, while also creating art to illustrate poems such as Goblin Market by the celebrated poet Christiana Rosetti, his sister. So actually he wrote different kind of sonnets, and there, that is where he tried to express the different themes actually and the different subjects into his poems. Rossetti's personal life was closely linked to his work, especially his relationship with his models and muses Elizabeth Siddal and Fanny Cornforth and Jane Morris. So actually both his professional and personal life were togetherly, you see, interconnected. Christiana Rosetti, you see, I just introduced to you actually her name, very famous name for the development of this Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. You see these two people, D.G. Rossetti and this Christiana Rosetti, devoted their whole time and energy for the development of this movement. And she was born in 1830 and died in 1894, was an English poet who wrote a variety of romantic, devotional and children's poems. She wrote many, you see, different kind of poems for the development of the children, for the devotion and for the romanticism. She is perhaps best known for her long poem, Goblin Market, her love poem, Remember, and for the birds of the Christmas carol in the bleak midwinter. So these were some of the primary works which were, you see, composed by Christiana Rosetti. But as a matter of fact, she did a lot for the development of this movement. In her late teens, you see, Rossetti became engaged to the painter James Collinson, the first of three suitors. He was like her brothers Dante and William, one of the founding members of the avant-garde artistic group, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, that was founded in 1848, has been discussed already. The engagement was broken in 1850 when he reverted to Catholicism. Later she became involved with the linguist Charles Cayley, but declined to marry him, also for religious reasons. The third offer came from the painter John Bradt, whom she also refused. So this was what about her personal life, and this was what you see in the first slide we discussed about her work that she did for the development of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. So in today's session, my dear friends, we have discussed about the Victorian period particularly, and in the Victorian period we have discussed about Robert Browning, and after that we have discussed about the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and how it developed what it was like, and these two, D.G. Rossetti and Christiana Rosetti, and their you see, development, what they did for the development of this age. That's what we have discussed. Thank you very much.